tiny creatures in northern Tasmania are about to make the biggest trip of their lives. The eastern quoll is endangered, but a mission to save it is underway.
Our wildlife is our heritage. Our wildlife is who we are. We in Australia are very proud of our wildlife, but we don't protect them properly.
There are more than 500 animals like the eastern quoll on Australia's threatened species list, and it's growing. Australia has the worst mammal extinction rate in the world.
Our system for protecting threatened species in this country is fundamentally broken. And we don't have the laws in place that protect their critical habitats, and we're certainly not investing anywhere near enough money in their recovery.
We had a custodial role to look after that biodiversity, and we've utterly dropped the ball.
Can you guarantee that no more species will go extinct while you're in this role?
Of course I can't. But all I can say is that I don't want to see any more species go extinct while I'm in this role.
These eastern quolls are being taken to mainland Australia, where they became extinct more than 50 years ago. They'll be released into a national park in New South Wales. But there are no guarantees of success. It's been tried once before, and only 6 out of 20 survived their first year on the mainland.
Australia's track record is appalling when it comes to saving our unique wildlife. For some animals, there's hope, but hundreds of species are at risk of being wiped out. Tonight on Four Corners, we investigate how Australia found itself in the midst of an extinction crisis.
Ecologist Bronwyn Fancourt is headed to Bruny Island off the coast of Tasmania. It's the last stronghold of the eastern quoll.
Bruny Island's quoll central, basically. In the end of the day, this is our biggest eastern quoll population, and if something happens to the population on Bruny, the species as a whole is in dire straits. So I keep coming down on a regular basis just to monitor the population.
Eastern quolls are nocturnal. To monitor them, Dr. Fancourt spends hours in the dark searching.
There's another one. Here he goes. There's a quoll.
These carnivorous little creatures only live for about 3 years. Here on Bruny Island, the count is going well. But on Tasmania's main island, their numbers have halved since the early 2000s.
What it turns out was there was a period of unsuitable weather. So for quolls like it cold and they like it dry. But there was a sustained period of warm, wet weather, which didn't agree with them, and their numbers dropped around that time. And while the weather's since improved, the quolls just haven't been able to recover their numbers since. Unfortunately, a few get hit by cars. I'm sure cats take out a few young ones. There's a few bits and pieces that they can cope with as a large population, but now their numbers are just so small, they can't outpace all those existing things that were there before.
Dr. Fancourt's work documenting the eastern quolls brought their decline to the attention of the world.
They are listed federally and they are listed internationally as endangered on both of those listings. So they've gone from not being listed to endangered.
How worrying is that?
It's very worrying because it can happen so quickly. That just shows you how quickly it can happen. And I guess we saw that on the mainland. The numbers were always high and overabundant, and they've gone from overabundant to extinct in a matter of years.
To try to help the eastern quoll, $1.5 million has been promised by the federal government. But many threatened species don't get that kind of attention.
We do need to also recognise that those species have as much right to existence and recovery as the eastern quoll. At the moment they're being neglected, and with that neglect it's far more likely that those species will just disappear into oblivion without us even realising that they were in danger, let alone becoming extinct.
The government says it's invested more than $400 million in threatened species recovery. But scientists say only a fraction of this is directly spent on species protection.
The problem is it actually takes a lot of resources to keep species in the game. So we're currently spending about 1/10 on what we need to spend to actually conserve all of our threatened species that are on our threatened species list. We are already picking winners and losers, of course. By not funding all species to the level that's required to keep them in the game, we're essentially allowing quite a lot of species to fail.
The trajectory of most of the species...
The new Environment Minister, Susan Lee, was sworn in last month.
It's not about waving a checkbook at the levels of threatened species. It's about sensible funding, which we do. It's about on-ground funding.
The scientists from the government-funded Threatened Species Hub say Australia is spending 1/10 of what it needs to save all the species on our threatened species list. What are you going to do about that?
I would say that state governments need to engage on this as well, and that what I see as being a key intervention is managed by the state governments. Now, I'm not passing the buck to the states. I'm simply saying that this is not something the federal government can do alone.
Just before sunset in the Central Highlands in Victoria, these volunteers are looking for Leadbeater's possums. Once thought to be extinct, the animal was rediscovered in the 1960s and declared the state's faunal emblem.
We think there are probably between 1,000 and 3,000 animals, which is a very small population. And they are listed now federally as critically endangered. The Zoological Society of London considers them the 10th most endangered mammal in the world.
Steve Meacher from Friends of Leadbeater's Possum is trying to get more protection for the animal.
The situation in Australia is that a lot of this work isn't being done by government agencies, so if volunteers like us weren't doing it, it just wouldn't be done and the animals would be going extinct.
The Leadbeater's possum, as we know, is a critically endangered species. It's suffered catastrophic population declines over the last 20 years. They're well documented. It's probably one of our best documented species. It's so tiny. There you go.
It's coming back down again.
Oh, it's going back in, maybe.
It's gone back.
Yes, it's gone back home. It was tiny.
It did look like a young.
So small.
It didn't have the confidence of an adult the way it was moving.
The volunteers try to spot the animals as they pop out of their nests. They're only a handspan long and have a distinguishing black stripe down their back.
It knows we're here. It's just trying to work us out.
They're so endangered, since 2014, every verified sighting triggers a 200-metre buffer zone, protecting the area from logging.
Well, we've just observed 2 Leadbeater's possums coming out of the nest crack.
So it's rare to see them like that?
Yes, it's rare to see them at all, but to have one like that posing for us was a gift. Just wonderful.
Since the buffer rule came in, there's been more than 500 new sightings of the possums.
The bottom line is that there's been a huge amount of extra effort to find animals, and that's wonderful, but it doesn't tell you what the decline is.
that doesn't tell you the trend. So when you go back to sites year after year after year, we can see that there's been a 50% decline in the number of occupied sites in the last 20 years. So the population trajectory for Leadbeater's possum is clear. It's significantly downwards.
Leadbeater's possums need big, old trees to nest in, but the amount of suitable forest available for them is declining.
We're seeing record low levels of old-growth forest. We're seeing increases in the number of fires. We've seen very little change in the level of pressure on the forest. In fact, it's significantly greater than it's ever been.
A vast swathe of prime Leadbeater's habitat was burned in the Black Saturday bushfires in 2009. The area where they live is also a key source of timber for the state's forestry industry.
Another fire and ongoing logging would basically nail the rest of the populations. The remaining parts of the landscape are essentially the small scrappy bits with very few large old trees left within them, and essentially you'll see rapid degradation of the remaining habitat, which is exactly what we've seen.
Forestry is a complex business. Anyone who has never had the chance to see it in operation, it's an amazing thing to see the care and concern and attention to detail that takes place in our native forest operations.
So this is a logging coupe that was harvested probably a couple of years ago.
Fire is also used as a tool by the forestry industry after logging to encourage regeneration. Ecologist David Lindenmayer has studied these forests and the Leadbeater's possum for more than 3 decades. His work has won him an Order of Australia.
There are no big trees in this system. It's going to take 200 years for this area to develop to become new habitat for animals like Leadbeater's possum, greater gliders, yellow-bellied gliders. So, the best part of 2 centuries before this system is going to be functional habitat for those threatened animals again.
But these regeneration fires sometimes get out of control.
Well, that's totally fried, isn't it? There's just no way you'll get animals in there.
Professor Lindenmayer and his colleague Lachlan McBurney are checking out this logging coupe right next to a Leadbeater's possum buffer zone. The fire has burned part of the protected area.
So the whole idea of the buffer zones is to actually protect the habitat. And clearly that fire's burnt right into the area that had the records of the animals. So, that's not even mediocre management in terms of what we should be doing here.
Would that then be intentional or just careless?
Careless. I feel appalled by this. I feel offended that people don't take these wildlife issues, these conservation issues, seriously enough to do their management properly. Remember, these are public forests that are supposed to be being managed for all the range of values. The value of that area as a high conservation value area for Leadbeater's possum and for other animals has basically been desecrated.
State-owned Vic Forests has told Four Corners it's investigating this incident to find potential improvements in these practices. And burning is inherently difficult, and this low-intensity burn did go beyond containment lines. This happens in perhaps 1% of burns.
Fires, as we all know, are inexact sciences. So sometimes they may not be exactly across a line that you drew. They might be just a little bit inside it. I don't know the specifics of this example.
After an increase in sightings, the forestry industry applied 2 years ago to get the possum downgraded from critically endangered to endangered. It also cites a study that shows Leadbeater's possums in 6 areas up to 15 kilometres from their known range.
The great news is that there are thousands and thousands of possums, and that is wonderful news. And frankly, everyone involved in this whole process, I think, should be celebrating that. And most people are, to be honest, because the forest industry cares deeply about its threatened species.
What would be the benefit for your members of getting the Leadbeater's possum downlisted from critically endangered to endangered?
Well, we haven't really looked into what the benefit might be. We just want to make sure that the appropriate science is applied to all of the native animals that also cross into the native forest estate.
With that species, that there are more individuals turning up at the moment, and that's largely because the census techniques are being increasingly better than they used to be. And we know that far more people are searching for them in the forests as well. So that, yes, we're certainly detecting many more Leadbeater's possums than we were 10 or 20 years ago, but that doesn't alter the fact by any means of the rate of decline, of population decline of that species.
My interest in the environment began when I was about 6 when...
Biologist John Winoski helped draft a federal government recovery plan to save the Leadbeater's possum in 2016, but it's never been finalised and implemented.
Most of the area had been completely destroyed for housing development.
Today, the Federal Environment Minister announced the possum's critically endangered status will be retained.
Should the recovery plan be implemented and approved, then it's unlikely that that 200 metre buffer would be maintained. It would be most likely to be increased. So timber harvesting currently, without the recovery plan, is being allowed to have a significant impact on the Leadbeater's possum, and I suspect that the recovery plan, once implemented, would reduce the impact of timber harvesting on that species.
Critics say the longer that this recovery plan sits on the shelf, the more damage is being done to Leadbeater's possum habitat that may be prevented by that recovery plan. Is this a top priority for you?
Well, you're asking me something that I don't have first-hand knowledge of. So I'm aware of the Leadbeater's possum issue, and I know it concerns a lot of, particularly people in the area of Victoria, where it's one of 2 unique habitats for that small Australian mammal. So I'm interested to see what we can do, but I'm not going to prejudge my advice.
Thank you.
Victoria's Labor Premier Daniel Andrews has been criticised for not doing enough to protect the possum.
I don't think it's clear yet that we can actually still have a viable timber industry and still have Leadbeater's possum. I think we probably will lose it if we keep going the way we're going.
Under immense pressure to keep the logging industry afloat, in 2017, the Andrews government purchased a stake in a sawmill with $61 million of taxpayer money. Just 2 months ago, Vic Forests announced a 5-year plan that allows it access to new areas within the Central Highlands for logging.
Was the purchase of the mill a bad idea? Has that signed the death warrant for the Leadbeater's possum?
It's certainly not going to help. With all that extra pressure on the forest, we need to remember that a huge amount of the forest was already burnt in 2009. And the timber release plan, just announced in late April, is going to ramp up even further pressure on an already heavily logged and extensively burnt landscape. So the vast majority of species are not designed, in an evolutionary sense, to be able to deal with this level of disturbance.
Premier, Stephanie March from Four Corners.
Sure.
Have you put vested interest...
The Premier declined to do an interview with Four Corners, so we approached him at an event in Melbourne.
Why won't you do an interview with Four Corners about these issues?
Well, you're interviewing me now.
But this is only because your office said you have no time to speak to us in the next 3 weeks, so we've had to come and doorstop you here.
Well, you're talking to me now.
Why won't your Environment Minister do an interview?
Well, you need to speak to her.
Why won't Vic Forests do an interview?
Well, we can have an interview about interviews if you like.
Are you stuck between a rock and a hard place when it comes to the interests of the unions and the forestry industry protecting the Leadbeater's possum?
No.
What did you get out of purchasing the Hayfield sawmill in terms of protecting the Leadbeater's possum?
Well, we were able to secure the livelihoods of many people, and I think if you went and had a chat to them, they might be a little more supportive of that than you seem to be. But at the same time, these are challenging issues. Finding a balance is not easy, but we remain committed to doing that. This is unfinished business, and this industry faces some really significant challenges, and we're committed to working to try and find the balance point that deals with issues of biodiversity and threatened species, together with the sustainability of our forests and protecting jobs.
In the southern forests of Tasmania, another threatened species is struggling to survive. Dr. Dejan Stojanovic is inspecting the damage done by a fire that was caused by a lightning strike.
Jesus. It used to be a very big tree. My God.
This tree was hundreds of years old. There are very few like it left in these forests. It was a home for the animal Dr. Stojanovic has spent the last 9 years studying, the swift parrot.
We're really lucky to work on swift parrots because they're beautiful, they're charismatic. A lot of people already really gave a damn about swift parrots before we even started working on this species. But it's a bit of a different issue when it comes to formally protecting them.
Swift parrots fly from the mainland to breed here on Tasmania's east coast. They're noisy, active and designed to fly fast. These birds are in peril.
Swift parrots are now listed as critically endangered. Critically endangered is one step before extinct, so really it's about as bad as it can get without them all being dead. Swift parrots are literally the size, shape and colour of gum leaves, and they live in gum trees, so counting them is really a challenge. The kind of best educated guesses are about 2,000 birds, basically 1,000 pairs, but I think that that's pretty optimistic, to be honest.
He says funding to help the parrots is hard to come by.
Threatened species conservation is so poorly funded in this country that we've quite regularly had to turn to crowdfunding to fund really basic aspects of our research. So, for instance, nest boxes are a quite widely applied tool for threatened species, but we had no idea if they'd work on swift parrots. But where are you going to get a grant to do a trial to see if nest boxes will work on swift parrots? It's just the money for that just doesn't exist, so we had to crowdfund.
These birds are facing multiple threats. Like for many Australian animals, invasive species are a huge problem.
Across rural Australia, there are too many introduced pests and animals attacking and changing our native animal habitat. That's the area that I want to focus on as Minister, because something can be done.
Unfortunately, invasive predators in particular are very difficult to manage. Cats are everywhere now in Australia, and they eat about 1 million birds a day. 360 million birds a year are consumed by cats. Foxes, probably a similar sized impact. So we really do have to address this if we're going to actually conserve biodiversity in this country. But when you've got a threat that's everywhere, it's very hard to manage.
The problem for swift parrots and other birds in this forest isn't cats or foxes. It's another invasive animal.
The primary cause of their decline today is predation by introduced sugar gliders in context of severe habitat loss that's ongoing across Tasmania today. As sugar gliders, which are introduced to Tasmania, crawl into the nests of swift parrots at night, where they kill and eat the female and her eggs. And in some places, up to 100% of swift parrots can be killed in a nesting colony. And on average, about half of the female parrots that attempt to nest in a given year are actually killed by gliders. That's 50% every year.
But scientists say fire and logging in these same forests exacerbates the problem.
We've found with our research over 10 years of looking at this problem, when you start to cut out sections of forest and leave a smaller and smaller patchwork of suitable habitat, that's when the glider problem escalates. So it looks like the more we kind of hem swift parrots in between deforestation and their predators, we're actually escalating all the processes that are driving these birds to extinction.
Why can't logging in swift parrot habitats stop and happen elsewhere in Tasmania instead?
Forestry operations in Tasmania are being modified. They're changing their practices to try to assist with the swift parrot problem, the crisis. And
how are they doing that?
They're modifying the coops that they access and changing the time of year and that sort of thing to make sure that they're minimising their impact. Anyone who's saying that if you stop forestry altogether, you're going to save swift parrots is wrong. And I think they know they're wrong because the greatest danger to the parrot is the sugar glider.
The options for managing predation by sugar gliders are really challenging. I don't think that's one that we can manage anywhere near as easily as we can with things like zoning of forestry, reducing the amount of timber harvesting that occurs in critical areas for nesting for swift parrots. We can and should be able to manage that threat much more effectively than what we're doing at the moment.
The state and federal agreement that allows logging in Tasmania's forests has just been extended for another 20 years.
Why should we care if the swift parrot becomes extinct?
If we can't bring ourselves to care about the swift parrot, and what about the next thing after that? Like, where's the end point of that attitude? We really need to protect swift parrots and to figure out a way to protect animals like this and bring them back from the brink for all the other creatures that are on their way to becoming as threatened as swift parrots.
There are more than 1,800 plants and animals on Australia's threatened species list.
A third of our listed threatened species are not monitored at all. So we could be losing them and we wouldn't know.
Well, the monitoring does happen at state government level as well as federal government level, and the Commonwealth can't
But
be
they're
everywhere.
on your list.
They're on the list because it's our responsibility to list them, but it's not our responsibility to take every single next step of intervention.
I guess there must be some sort of a disconnect because clearly, we have threatened species legislation in this country, but it's not resourced and enacted very well, and it's not really working at the end of the day.
In Moreton Bay in Queensland, Dr. Rob Clemens and volunteer birdwatcher Rob Bush are looking for one very special bird, the critically endangered eastern curlew.
Yeah, so we've got some pelicans and pied oyster catchers and cormorants, but haven't laid eyes on any eastern curlew yet.
I can't see any at the moment. They need to go around the other side.
They're remarkable birds, the more you get to know them. They're using the position of the sun and the moon and the stars as a calendar and as a clock, and also as a navigational aid. So they've got all these built-in things that enable them to traverse the globe twice a year. And in their lifetime, they might go 400,000 kilometers. And that's from here to the moon, plus a little bit.
The eastern curlew spends the majority of its time here in Australia. The bird's population has declined 80% in 30 years.
Eastern curlew in particular come primarily from northern China and southern Russia for the most part. An eastern curlew will leave here in March or early as late February, and will head up often to the Yellow Sea, and there it will fatten up again before it goes to its breeding grounds in Russia.
These Moreton Bay mudflats are an important feeding ground for the eastern curlew. They poke their long bills into the mud to find shellfish and crabs to eat.
An eastern curlew will get here and they'll be kind of skin and bones, so they'll have run out of all that fat and they'll have to eat out on the mud flats. There are things that you can do for a number of species to recreate feeding habitat, but not for eastern curlew. That mud flat that they use, they seem highly adapted to it, and for whatever reason, they just don't use other places to feed.
This mudflat where eastern curlews forage has been declared an internationally important wetland under a global treaty called the Ramsar Convention. Now the birds face losing part of this crucial habitat. This is where a private developer wants to build up to 3,600 apartments as part of a new residential, commercial and tourism precinct.
This whole area through here will be made into the new development. There'll be a small pleasure boat harbour in the middle of it. So this whole area will change.
The development would cover 42 hectares of the Ramsar site.
It's actually going to be out on the sea, on the mudflats. It's an incredibly beautiful place, and yet they're going to excavate, they're going to dewater, and they're going to put a concrete development and canals and marinas actually out onto Moreton Bay.
A lot of people just storm into this industry and they don't realise the time it takes to get approvals, the time, the environmental issues that face us. Yeah, jumping around.
The developer behind the proposal is Lang Walker. He's one of the richest men in Australia, with an estimated net worth of more than $3.5 billion. And his company is a big political donor. The same financial year the Walker Corporation submitted the first proposal for the development, it donated more than $200,000 to the federal Liberal Party.
Do donations to political parties have an impact when it comes to making decisions under our Environmental Protection Act?
No, they don't.
What about the $200,000 that the Walker Corporation, who's proposing this development in Toondah Harbour, gave to the Liberal Party during its initial proposal phase? What do you think they wanted for that money?
I have no knowledge about that. I have no personal understanding or view about the corporation, the process, or any of those on-the-ground issues. What I can categorically say is that donations, any which way, to whomever, wherever, will have no impact whatsoever on the decisions that I make as Environment Minister.
Documents obtained from the Federal Environment Department through Freedom of Information list the Ramsar Secretariat as opposing the development in 2017. Despite the Secretariat opposing it, the state and federal governments have explored ways for it to go ahead, including a controversial move, changing the Ramsar boundary. To do that, they'd have to argue the development is in the urgent national interest.
That's the thing that we find totally incredulous, that the Australian government is prepared to trash its international reputation, because that's what's going to happen.
Will you consider changing the Ramsar boundary to accommodate the development?
Let's wait and see what the advice is. I'm not going to speculate at this stage. I'm simply not going to speculate.
The Walker Corporation says changing the boundary is no longer under consideration. But documents show the Federal Environment Department still has serious concerns. It warns the current proposal will seriously disrupt the life cycle of eastern curlews and other migratory species. That it's likely to have significant impacts on dolphins, turtles, dugongs and koalas. And that no development of this scale or likely impact has been approved within an existing Ramsar site in Australia. Despite this, the department has recommended the project move to the next stage of assessment, an Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS.
The Department of the Environment has initially advised that this project should be considered clearly unacceptable, shouldn't even go to an EIS, it shouldn't get past the first base, because it is going into an internationally protected wetland, which Australia signed up to. We ratified the Ramsar Convention, and it should be, safe from development.
Here in Australia, there's political sort of ministerial discretion. So as long as the minister has decided, I've considered those issues, can make a decision that's completely against the advice of the department or what would be in the best interest of conservation generally. So it's that political wiggle room that exists within the Australian framework that's a huge problem.
I'm confident that the processes will be handled correctly, that the advice and the investigations about all of the important matters of environmental significance that you have raised will be included in the advice that's provided to me.
The Walker Corporation says the latest plan includes more conservation areas, but environmentalists say it's not good enough.
It's a Ramsar site. It's home to critically endangered, vulnerable migratory shorebirds. It's a key biodiversity area, and it's a marine park. And we can't protect that. It's an absolute exemplar of why our system, our nature laws are broken.
The Walker Corporation proposed to offset the impact of its development by protecting eastern curlew habitat thousands of kilometres away in the Yellow Sea.
Putting offsets for development impacts on one side of the world in another, where the Australian government has no jurisdiction, no capacity to enforce those offsets, no capacity to monitor them, it's fantasy. We're going to go and protect something in the Yellow Sea, but we're going to lose that habitat at this end of these birds' migratory route. And it is a really important place for the eastern curlew. So where are they going to go on the southern end of their migration? It doesn't stack up and it doesn't make sense.
James Trezise is a policy analyst for the Australian Conservation Foundation. He used to work for the Federal Environment Department and helped write the offset policy. He says offsets are supposed to be a last resort, but they're being exploited by developers.
Looking at it now, I'd say it's been a fundamental failure in implementation. We have seen very little evidence of biodiversity offsets actually benefiting threatened species.
The development still needs federal government approval.
The odds are very heavily weighted that the Walker Group will get their development to go across the line.
But the eastern curlew has a lot of supporters who are determined to save it.
Our protest today is about respecting Ramsar and getting our politicians to stand up and make nature laws count.
So we've got 3 petitions here today.
We decided that we were going to draw a line in the mud to say no to this development. Now, we expected 100 people, maybe 150. Over 500 people turned up. It was a massive turnout. So this is generating outrage at a broader community level.
Its supporters believe the bird's decline is symbolic of a much bigger problem.
Our nature laws are broken. That something that ticks every single conservation box can be, yeah, OK, we're going to put 3,600 apartments on it, not on our watch. Thank you.
I mean, we're getting to a point where, we're reducing the capacity for this planet to do the things that it needs to do for us to survive. But certainly if we lose something like the eastern curlew, it's just unnecessary, totally avoidable. And, you wouldn't go burn the Mona Lisa because you could. You could put it somewhere and keep it safe.
A recent UN report found across the world 1 million species are at risk of being wiped out.
What that report says is that it's not just going to threaten the plants and animals, but we are an interconnected ecosystem, and it's going to actually start having knock-on effects to us as well and our society in a whole range of ways. So it does represent a wake-up call.
We are in an extinction crisis, and it's real. Mass extinctions in historical times have occurred due to cataclysms, the impact of a meteor on Earth and the equivalent of a nuclear winter. Now we're seeing extinction rates akin to those historical extinction events brought about by humans.
Australia has one of the worst extinction records on the planet. And scientists say we're not doing enough to turn around this human-induced crisis.
Look, it's embarrassing. To be an Australian, it's embarrassing being involved with wildlife. To be an Australian, to have this record of extinction and still not really show that we're doing anything about it.
There's no real sign of it abating in the near future, and if we want it to stop, we're going to have to do a lot more than we're currently doing. We have millions of years of evolution behind every one of these things. They're like amazing artworks. And every time we lose one, I think we've lost something of ourselves and we've lost something of society.